What do you think rebellion sounds like? A shout? A rock band? A harsh dissonance? Well, our next piece is the proof that sometimes rebellion can sound simply like a beautiful melody. Many melodies, in fact, the bounty of beautiful themes that Antonín Dvořák offered up in his boundlessly tuneful Symphony No. 8. Dvořák composed this piece in just over 2 months in 1889 at his summer home in his native Bohemia in the present-day Czech Republic. Listening to this piece, we can tell that it was a beautiful summer indeed. One of Dvořák's biographers has written, "When one walks in those forests surrounding Dvořák's country home, with the birds singing and the leaves of trees rustling in a gentle breeze, one can virtually hear the music. The tunes in the symphony are so many and so lyrical that there seems to be another one everywhere you turn." Dvořák was a man for whom new melodies were practically always on tap. We know that he sometimes even scrawled them on his shirt cuffs if he didn't have a music notebook on hand, and he brought them into this symphony in abundance. For many of Dvořák's contemporaries, that was the problem. There were simply too many of them. To Johannes Brahms, for instance, who was otherwise a generous supporter of Dvořák's music, the piece was just too much of a good thing. Brahms had this to say about the symphony, and I quote, "There is too much that's fragmentary, incidental, loiters about in the piece. Everything is fine, musically captivating, and beautiful, but there are no main points." This wasn't just a musical criticism. At base, it was a national and even a political one. To understand what I mean by that, it's important to remember how thoroughly dominated the musical world was, and especially the form of the symphony, by the canon of German composers. Beethoven had brought the symphony to its height of craft, and Brahms was his designated heir. Now, what did people value about the symphonies that Beethoven wrote? The reason he was considered such a master of the form is that he wrote with tremendous efficiency. That is, he made the greatest possible use of limited materials. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is a perfect example of this. Virtually the entire piece is built from different forms of the famous opening four-note motif. So to the followers of Beethoven, what made a piece great wasn't having a lot of separate ideas, but the opposite, having just a few ideas that you get the maximal use out of. You couldn't just have a lot of tunes that weren't connected and that didn't develop. Now, Dvořák knew all that, but he decided that his Eighth Symphony would be, in his words, different, with individual thoughts worked out in a new way. And that way had everything to do with the nature, the sounds, and the folk songs of his native Bohemia. So, this symphony begins with a melancholy folk tune-like melody in the low strings. But then it changes. The flute suddenly sings an impish little bird call. That in itself leads to yet another melody. Similarly, in the second movement, there's a moment where the music gathers into what sounds like a thunderstorm. For a moment, we seem to be headed to a tempestuous climax. But instead, all the tension suddenly dissipates, and the violins play out a carefree little ditty accompanied by the plucking of the cellos. This kind of thing was anathema to Brahms. It was a perfect example of what he meant when he said that there were no main points in this symphony. And although Brahms didn't say it, it also meant that the piece was not especially Germanic. And again, it's clear that all of this was intentional, because Dvořák was deeply attached to his Czech homeland, and he resisted attempts by the musical establishment to Germanize his work. When Simrock, the German publisher of his music, which Brahms had recommended him to, tried to publish his first name as Anton to make it sound more German than the original Antonin, Dvořák refused. He wasn't Anton. He also insisted that Simrock publish Czech titles for his pieces. With the Symphony No. 8, his quarrel with Simrock boiled over, and they stopped doing business together for 5 years. Today, it's hard to imagine that a piece this sunny could have been at the center of such a storm.